There we go.
Looks good.
All right, gorgeous. Is it okay to get started?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thanks again. And it's really wonderful to be here and an honor. It's making me a little lovesick because I live down in Southern California, as Snowdy mentioned, as I worked at the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. And so I have a deep affinity for Los Angeles and Southern California native plants, white sage being one of them. And so you're making me a little homesick, but I'm excited to talk with you tonight about our Saging the World campaign. And this is a really beautiful, exciting, and important campaign. And it's very important as well to stress that this is an effort to support Indigenous-led advocacy to safeguard white sage. Indigenous communities in Southern California and Northern Baja have long fought for the recognition and protection of white sage. And CNPS is coming in to help support in the ways that we can. And so I'll be sharing some of those ways that we're supporting Indigenous efforts. And I will be giving tonight a broad overview of the issues surrounding white sage that you might be aware of, you might not be, but I will give you a snapshot into what's going on in our Southern California and Northern Baja region with white sage and what we're doing to address the issues that we're seeing. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge my
Guys, excuse me. If you are not muting yourself, could you please mute yourself?
Okay, thanks. So I just wanted to acknowledge my complete and absolute partners in this, Rose Ramirez and Deborah Small. They're very dear friends and mentors, and they've been at the forefront of white sage advocacy work for the last 4 to 5 years. They are the authors of the Ethnobotany Project, have written in News from Native California, and have led other projects and initiatives to support Southern California and Northern Baja Native cultures, specific issues such as the white sage work. And so we are really working in concert very much with Rose and Deborah, as well as a wider community of Indigenous partners. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that at the top. So I wanted to acquaint you briefly with white sage. Many of you might already know this really beautiful emblematic plant. White sage, or Salvia apiana is the scientific name, is an important member of coastal sage scrub and chaparral habitats, which is a pretty prime plant communities in your chapter region. And so white sage, you're in fact in the heartland of white sage. White sage's natural range is from San Luis Obispo County down to Northern Baja. And that's really the only place in the world that it grows. It's endemic to that region, a fairly narrow when you consider all things. And it's a beautiful plant. As you can see here, it has silvery foliage, one of the strongest aromas of any plant probably in the California native flora, and has glorious inflorescences. Those are 4 to 6 foot flower stalks that shoot up in the spring and have the most wonderful little, very complex actually white flowers that only specific pollinators can actually successfully pollinate, which I'll tell a little bit more of that story as we go. Snowdy mentioned the land acknowledgement, and I think it's very important to keep that framed throughout this conversation and all conversations around California native plants. So Indigenous communities have tended relationships with white sage for thousands of generations. I have shown here a map that essentially shows the natural range of white sage, and it is also showing, and this is from Native Land, which is a really great website to visit. It is also showing the tribal communities and historic and current ranges of these tribal communities. So you can kind of get a sense for all of the different communities that have had really deep, long-lasting relationships with white sage for thousands of generations. So this plant is of critical cultural and ecological importance. And so I wanted to share a few of those as we go into the larger issues around white sage. And these are partners in this work. I'll share more later on about a documentary that CNPS is working on, about different legislative possibilities that we're exploring. And through each of those, we are working with Indigenous partners to shape the direction and the approach to those initiatives. So Norma Mesa is a political leader and cultural educator in Tecate in northern Baja, and she is Kumeyaay. And white sage is an intrinsic part of her life, of her culture, of her ancestral connections. And it's used for everything from masking the smell of a hunter to bath and beauty products to being deeply, deeply ceremonial. And I think it's pretty profound. You start to get a sense for how deeply rooted white sage is in, for instance, Kumeyaay culture, when Norma tells you that just like people need to prepare for a ceremony, such as a funeral or a wedding or any other very significant event, just as people might need to enter into their own kind of mental state for that, Norma and other Kumeyaay will put white sage in a space, in a dark space for 3 days to allow it to prepare, just like a human would prepare for ceremony. And so you can start to see how, again, deeply rooted and very important this plant is for Indigenous communities in Southern California and Baja. Another partner in this work is Heidi Harper Lucero, and she's a Hashaman and Mutsunolone. And again, please visit that. I'll share that link at the end, the native land link, because you can see where these tribes and Indigenous communities are. So Heidi's a Hashaman and she's Mutsunolone, and she is an educator. She has also been involved in archaeology with NAGPRA. And NAGPRA is the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So she reburies ancestors. And so when a university or an institution has wrongfully brought ancestors up from the ground, Heidi works to rematriate or repatriate those ancestors. And so throughout that very important process, white sage is a critical component. So she'll tell you that as the funeral procession is driving to the burial site, white sage is being burned. As ancestors are being lowered into the ground, white sage is being burned. And so her very real fear is that given the direction poaching is headed, climate change, development, that there will no longer be white sage accessible for these very, very important and crucial cultural practices. And so it's a pretty eye-opening thing when you hear that from someone who communicates just how deeply important white sage is. Kimberly Morales Johnson, who is Gabrielino Tongva. She is also an educator, and she has some pretty profound things to say, but she basically says that, we're going to get into the poaching issue in a little bit, but when someone, in her view, and in many of these Indigenous communities' views, white sage is seen as a relative. And if you even look at taxonomy and a Western view of science, certainly everything originated from common ancestors. And so there is an argument there, and there is certainly a foundation to that belief. And so in this framework, white sage is a plant relative. And so if you view it like that, as she does, and she and others have said white sage is so important that it's viewed as a grandmother plant. If you view it as that, and if you view it as a gift, and then you fast forward to what's happening today where people are culturally appropriating it, commodifying it, and the vast majority of that white sage comes from poached sources, then in her words, it's a way of pimping out the blessing. And I think that's a pretty powerful way to put it. And so this is very real for Indigenous community members across Southern California and Northern Baja. I also want to ground us in the ecological connections of this really important plant, Salvia apiana. So it has many ecological relationships, and many different fauna or animals rely on white sage. And I'll cover a little bit of those here. So I will first set the stage with this map. So this is a map of development in 2021 across the range of white sage in California. The white dots represent historic collections of white sage. The black polygons represent development. So you can already see here that we're dealing with about a 40 to 50% reduction of the natural range of white sage. And we're increasingly worried about the threat of poaching to the extant populations of white sage, which we'll cover. But I wanted to show you this just to give you a sense for, again, the range of this plant and just how endemic it is to a very specific Southern California region and just tiptoeing down into Baja. And so keep that range map in mind when we look at the range maps of these animal species that depend on white sage. So I'm going to show you several different types of animals, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how they interact with white sage. So I mentioned before that white sage has a really complex flower. It actually looks like a crazy folded up sock. And it takes a fairly hefty bee to sit on that flower to basically trip a series of mechanisms for the flower to open and for that bee to be able to pollinate it successfully. So scientists, I think back in the 50s and 60s, were looking in the San Gabriel Mountains at pollinators that visit white sage and pollinators that visit black sage, which is a very close relative that many of you probably know. So many different types of pollinators visit black sage, tons of butterflies, tons of bees. White sage, however, only had a handful of pollinators, a more limited palette of bees, a more limited palette of butterflies. And what these scientists observed was that the heavier bees, especially these carpenter bees, were really the only ones able to successfully pollinate white sage. So it's a pretty special plant, and it has a pretty special relationship with these bees. And so I want to point you to the range maps, and these maps come from iNaturalist, so they're by no means perfect, but they give you an indication for just how much of a puzzle piece the observations of these species fit with the range of white sage. Here's another species of carpenter bee, the Foothill Carpenter Bee. We have another larger native bee, which is the yellow-faced bumblebee. Some other pollinators include Costa's hummingbird. So hummingbirds do nectar on white sage flowers. Here's another great photo from Las Politas. And again, see just how much that range overlaps with the range of white sage. And then we get into seeds. So the seeds of white sage are nutritious and have been used as food and continue to be used as food by indigenous communities and by quite a handful of animals. And that includes Western harvester ants, kangaroo rats, and many different bird species, including the lesser goldfinch, our California quail. And then we have insect species that host on sage, salvia, and white sage. So the larva or the caterpillars of this moth, for instance, eats the white sage leaves and then will turn into the adult, such as this alfalfa looper moth. So the leaves are an important source of food too for this larger food web. Okay, so now we're up to what we call the viral trend of white sage. I've talked a little bit about the indigenous connections to this plant that are still very much alive today. I've talked about the ecological dynamics of this species. And so now I'm going to talk about the issues that we're currently facing and why CNPS started the Saging the World campaign with Rose, with Deborah, and in support of all of these indigenous efforts to protect this plant. So as you can see here, this is a influencer using white sage in a GIF. And so how did white sage go viral? So smudging has been popularized in movies and television for decades. It really started in the New Age movement, in the hippie movement, and those movements were co-opting smudging. Again, white sage only grows in Southern California, and so it was taken from indigenous communities in Southern California and Baja and put through the filter or the lens of the New Age movement and the hippie movement. And then what we've seen in the last decade is the power of social media for spreading this trend. So social media, places like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, influencers, television series, movies, all of these media, all of these mediums have created a viral trend out of smudging. And as it's created that trend, it's vastly culturally appropriated this practice. It looks completely out of context. And the sad truth is that the vast majority of the sage that are used in these instances that are purchased online, purchased in stores, come from wildcrafted sources. So here's just, this might make you a little dizzy, but here's just a very, very infinitesimally small amount of gifts from various TV shows, movies, and other sources showing how white sage has been completely appropriated into this quasi-ceremonial spiritual practice that doesn't actually resemble anything that indigenous communities use white sage for, and also speaks to a trend or the trend that supports it comes from wild crafted sage product, which is really untenable. And I'm just pointing out a few more places where you may have seen white sage used, but the scope of this issue is pretty drastic and alarming. And more recently, white sage has gone from being used predominantly as a smudge stick to, say, cleanse a space or to cleanse bad vibes, to being used in bath and body care products. And one alarming trend within that is the use of essential oils. So essential oils require a vast amount of a plant in order to create just a very infinitesimal amount of essential oil. And if you look, you can type in Alibaba right now, or a number of other retailers online, and you can type in white sage essential oil, and you will find near limitless supplies of this product. And there are very, very, very few growers of white sage. So what's pretty alarming is that you can rest assured that most of the white sage products you find online are from wildcrafted sources. And those wildcrafted sources exist in a very narrow band from San Luis Obispo to northern Baja. And so you're dealing with a global demand for this plant, both in terms of the cultural appropriation, the desire for those smudge sticks and the way it's become part of mainstream culture. You're also dealing with international demand from the kind of beauty and bath product industry. And so, again, all of the cultural appropriation that's going on and the new paradigms around bath and beauty products has created an international marketplace. And again, as I show you these images and go through the marketplace, what's important to keep in mind is just how limited of a range this plant has, and the fact that there are probably less than 10 retail growers of white sage. So the math doesn't add up, and that's what's really alarming about this situation. So white sage is sold everywhere, and that includes retailers like Amazon, Walmart, Alibaba, and Etsy. And as I mentioned, there's very few commercial growers of this plant. And in fact, I'll show you some examples where the fact that these plant products are coming from wildcrafted sources is actually celebrated. You'll see marketing slogans that say, collected from the mountains of California, or wildcrafted from the coastal mountains of Southern California. And so it's a celebrated facet. And it really requires education, both in terms of some of the consumers, all of the consumers that are purchasing it, but also some of the retailers. Some of the retailers are disconnected from the ethical considerations.
Okay. So it's about half an hour more.
Sorry.
So some of the retailers don't understand or don't necessarily realize that they're doing a bad thing by collecting from wildcrafted sources. And so that's one issue that we aim to address. And I just want to show you just some of these kind of horrifying galleries of white sage products, and you can see these for yourself. If you go to walmart.com, if you go to Etsy and you just type in white sage, or you type in smudge sticks, you'll be confronted by quite an endless array of white sage products. And again, these are just a few. One vendor in particular that I'm going to touch on is Juniper Ridge. Juniper Ridge has been selling wildcrafted products for, I think, over a decade. They have claimed to be making a shift towards growing all of the plants that they're harvesting from. But they create incense, bath and body products, straight up smudge sticks. And until at least recently, if their claims are true, the vast majority of those products are from wild sources. And what's alarming about Juniper Ridge is I think they've taken the store locator down from their website. But if you had been able to see their older site, you would see just how many store locations they have across the world. And so this just illustrates how far the scope and the reach of this issue is. It's really an international issue, international demand, international marketplace for white sage. Here's just one example. I wanted to show you one retailer who is creating white sage bundles from apparently coastal mountains in San Diego County. And this vendor doesn't see anything wrong or doesn't perceive any issue with creating and selling products from wild sources. And the reality is that when white sage is stripped out of the wild, it deprives the vast network of fauna and other ecological processes with that plant. White sage is very important in the plant communities that it grows. Equally, some of our indigenous partners, they'd go out, and I have some testimony later, go out to places that have been ancestral gathering grounds for thousands of generations. They arrive at that ancestral gathering ground where their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents had a relationship with that particular hill, that particular plant, that particular stand of white sage, and it's been totally wiped out and sold. And so when someone takes white sage from a wild source, yes, not only are they depriving it from that kind of food web, and I illustrated that with some of the organisms, the animals, you're also very likely taking from an individual, a family, a community that has had a relationship with that white sage plant or that white sage stand for a very long time. And so it just gets at this concept and this important concept that native plants have had deep relationships with native people for a very long time, and we have to see native plants through that lens. And now we're a part of that legacy, and people here in California that are not indigenous have the chance to cultivate native plants and create a relationship with the places that we call home. And I think that's why I'm so excited and empowered by native plants, because they give us the agency to support our habitats, to connect more deeply with place, and to become part of the legacy here in California in the places we live. Okay, and so I'm going to show you some pretty sobering images now about the poaching. So how that international demand is supplied. And these images come from a range of sources. Most of them come from the North Etiwanda Preserve, which is to the east of your chapter, just in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, over by Claremont. And over the past 5 years, it's been estimated that more than 20,000 pounds of white sage has been taken from that preserve alone. And these photos come from busts that happen almost daily in Etiwanda. And I've just posed here that busts are constantly being made on both sides of the border. This massive theft of white sage is happening in protected parks and tribal lands and private property. There was an article a couple months ago in Mexico News Daily that covered the poaching going on in northern Baja in areas like Tecate and Tijuana and Ensenada. And that's happening on tribal lands in Kumeyaay tribal lands, in Pai Pai tribal lands. And so you're having poachers infiltrate and poach in, really across lands, certainly across borders and across different places. We have testimony from private property owners who experience poachers driving in, breaking down fences, going into ranch land, taking white sage and driving off. It's a pretty lucrative plant for poachers. It's $30 a pound. And what we've heard is that the people that are caught poaching are paid 30 cents by these kind of unseen kingpins of this black market. And the really sad truth is that many of the people caught in the act of poaching are undocumented and are not part of the issue. they're being sent by profiteers who end up making $30 a pound for this plant. So there's this really awful toxic web of social issues caught up around white sage. Here's just a few more. So each of those duffel bags can hold as much as 300 pounds of white sage. So you can start to do the math just in terms of, and again, this is happening on a daily occurrence. Ron Goodman, who's the park ranger there, will say sometimes in the height of picking season, which can be early spring, early summer, you can have busts happening virtually every day. And so he'll have people in the park call him saying, Ron, I see people out, in this area of the park, and they have duffel bags and they're collecting white sage. And I think what's important to note is Etiwanda is a protected reserve with park rangers. And so what's really alarming to think is to extrapolate to all the areas that white sage grows where it doesn't have that protection. Currently, it has no specific legal protection around it, around white sage. And so that causes alarm to think that if this is happening in a place where there are park rangers, what about all the places that there is no law enforcement or any other mechanism to monitor white sage? One thing to just note is that Ron Goodman will say, maybe 5 years ago, poachers were using these trash cans and could only collect so much before they would have to take it out to whatever area they were then transporting it off to. But then when the duffel bags came into the picture, they were able to exponentially increase the amount of white sage that they were able to take because they could carry the duffel bags out like backpacks. So I mentioned, Ron said 15 to 20,000 pounds have been estimated to have been taken out of North Etiwanda Preserve in the last 5 years alone. Another park that we've been speaking with, it's called Fundación La Puerta, which I'll type in after the talk, and that's in Tecate. They monitor 2,000 acres across the border. So some of those acres are in Tecate, some of them are in the US. And over the last 5 years, those 2,000 acres of prime white sage habitat have been stripped of white sage. And they say that the people that they'll encounter are sometimes armed. So it's a pretty precarious situation across the board, and certainly in Northern Baja. You're looking at Teresa Romero and Diego Cordero, and they are amazing people. They lead the Santa Ynez Cultural Nursery, and they grow native plants for repatriation and rematriation in their tribal community, giving plants to elders, giving plants to community members to reconnect in terms of native food, basketry materials, ceremonial practices, and also to restore connections to these plant species. And so Teresa told us that 2 years ago, she went to her gathering spot for white sage, and when she got out there was no white sage to gather. And she says that, she really sees this as such a grievance against the tribes where traditionally white sage has always grown, especially in Southern California. And she's deeply concerned that because of the harvesting and the way it's being harvested, that the plant is not being cared for and will not replenish itself. And so what we're seeing in terms of the approaches for most of the poachers are to actually put chains around plants and pull them out by trucks, also to come in and just coppice plants down to the ground. There's really no discretion involved for most people in terms of how they gather the white sage. And so when people do that, the chance for that plant to come back in any meaningful way is really diminished. This is Norma again. And so her Kumeyaay community has close to 12,000 hectares. And she says the other day that she saw people cutting the sage, pruning everything down to the ground. And when we were talking with her, you can just see how emotional that is about seeing tribal land, and people are afraid to confront poachers because they can often be armed. It's just an unknown quantity. And so to see indigenous land being stripped of white sage is really, really a tragedy. And we're losing a tremendous amount of white sage populations and acreage in this process. So there's a couple things that I want to leave you with in terms of the positive. There are a lot of positive things happening, including this campaign, and there's a lot of ways to get involved. So here are three, the best things I can recommend to do now. One is to know your source and boycott wildcrafted sage products. If you don't buy white sage products, you can absolutely help by speaking with store managers when you see white sage, and writing to e-tailers, asking them to stop selling sage products harvested from the wild. So as this campaign progresses, we'll be creating formalized ways to do that, to write collectively with us to retailers like Etsy, and to others. So we'll keep you tuned about that. But I highly encourage, if you're out at places like World Market, Whole Foods, these are just a few that actually sell white sage, to feel empowered to write to those store branch managers, and let them know that it's not okay to be selling white sage if they don't know the source. Another really great thing you can do, and is one of my favorite things to do, of course, is to grow your own white sage and other native plants. So especially if you live in a place where white sage grows, which if you are part of the LA Santa Monica Mountains chapter, you are in the perfect place to grow white sage. Growing native plants is one of the best things you can do because you support the habitat that you call home. Additionally, if you want to use any of the plant material that you grow, whether it's for culinary purposes, for medicine, for whatever purposes you might be gathering plants for, when you grow native plants, you know the source. And Indigenous partners will say, you've put in the care, you've put in the love, you've put in the relationship. And so when you go to gather that plant and that medicine or that food, that love is being put right back into that plant. So the best thing you can do is to grow native plants specific to your area. And the beauty is that no matter where you live, there are native plants to connect with. So again, white sage is a great plant for you to think about in LA Santa Monica chapter, but Calscape, calscape.org is a really great place to go in and look up native plants specific to your region. So I'm sure many of you know this site, but if you don't, it's calscape.org, and you can go to that site, put in your zip code or address, and it will pull up a list of native plants specific to your region. And the last call to action here is to reorient your cultural lens. And this really comes from our Indigenous partners. Craig Torres, who's a Tongva educator, imparts to see plants as relationships and not resources. So to start seeing the plants around us, to start seeing ourselves really in relationship to those plants and part of an ecosystem. And I think that's a really important thing to do, to start changing the way we see, interact with, and know plants. And I want to cover a little bit about what we're doing. So CNPS, in partnership with Rose and Deborah, as well as a larger Indigenous community, are exploring policy and legislation solutions. Many of you might know that we were able to successfully shepherd a assembly bill for Dudleya last legislative cycle. So now Dudleya have specific legal protections. Dudleya are native succulents. And so we're coming off of that victory, looking at other possibilities and approaches for white sage. We're also creating a documentary, which I'm really excited to share in the coming months, called Saging the World, that centers on Indigenous connections and advocacy to white sage and what people can do to help and support. The third thing we're doing is we're using our mapping and vegetation tools at CNPS, such as our important plant areas mapping software, to understand the scope of poaching, impacts of climate change, and other threats. So it's pretty exciting and also terrifying is to be able to look at basically data crunch and do some analysis and make some projections to say, given all we know about climate change and development, or given what we know about access in terms of highways or other avenues to white sage populations, what can we start to postulate about the state of white sage in, say, 50 years or 100 years? And so those are pretty sobering analyses, and we look forward to sharing those. We're also working across this campaign to amplify Indigenous voices. And so the documentary is one part of that, but I will share a website in just a few slides that show other initiatives and efforts that Indigenous partners have led on behalf of white sage. And the other piece that we're excited about is co-creating public white sage festivals, which we're now looking at creating in the fall at Botanic Gardens, nurseries, and other partners, where people can come and adopt a white sage plant and meet Indigenous partners involved in the documentary and CNPS staff and volunteers. And so I will conclude there. So I absolutely invite you to get involved and stay tuned. This is the website that you can see a lot about what we covered tonight. And that's where we'll be posting campaign updates and other information. So thanks everybody. And I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Okay, David, do you want to unshare? And then I do have a short list of questions from the chat.
Sure.
One person did point out Juniper Ridge, and I think you more than covered that organization. So somebody pointed out that use of white sage by shamans is legitimate.
Is someone asking if it's legitimate?
No, they're saying use by shamans is legitimate. Was a comment more than anything, I guess. I guess that would be a native shaman, right? How do you?
Yeah, well, I think what's important is that white sage and the dimensions and ways that Indigenous communities connect to it really surpass, what most people think of in terms of the ceremonial or ritualistic aspects of white sage. So when most people think of white sage, they think of it as this ritualistic component, but the reality is that it's a much more complex and sometimes even just everyday connection to white sage. Like I mentioned, white sage has been used and continues to be used as shampoo, as a cure for menopause or an alleviation for menopause, used for hunting. So it's really a pretty encompassing plant, just like many of the other native plants that Indigenous people relate with. And yeah, I certainly can't speak on the shamanic use of white sage, but I just would say that Indigenous people have very deep connections with white sage. And if someone who's not Indigenous is using it, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's, a legitimized use of it. So I'll just say that.
Okay. I guess that, everybody's wondering why it couldn't be cultivated to break the market, especially tribes could, maybe cultivate it as a revenue stream.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in fact, that's what a lot of chatter is happening right now. Like even, which is exciting down in Baja, people are talking about creating commercial nurseries to grow white sage. It's so ubiquitous in marketplaces. You can go to stores and kind of wholesale markets in Baja and just encounter rooms full of white sage. So there is obviously a huge demand for it. And there's also this bubbling desire to grow it, to create a ethically cultivated source for white sage. So it's exciting to hear that. And it's also, there are a lot of nurseries in Southern California that sell white sage. So I can list a few, like Theodore Payne is one very close to, kind of in the heart of your chapter, Moosa Creek, Tree of Life. But if you go to Calscape and you look at the white sage profile, there should be a toggle for you to be able to see what nurseries have historically carried white sage. So that's a good option if you're really excited and committed to growing white sage. I would start with Calscape to identify what nurseries are near you and what, if any, have carried white sage historically.
Another question, it's like, how do we stop pop culture? I think, I don't know, it's a good question. How do you?
Well, I think the reality is that my hope, and I think we need to do some real audience research around this, is that many of the communities and groups that use white sage currently. So people in the New Age and wellness communities, people in yoga practices. It's also, white sage has been called the smell of protest. So it's kind of become part of protests in the last 5 to 10 years. My hope is that the people that use white sage are actually receptive to this message. I think for the vast majority of people, they just don't know where white sage is coming from. They see it for sale, they see it in brick and mortar locations, they see it online, they see it being used across mainstream media. And so they purchase it and bring it into their lives, or a friend gifts it to them, or they see it in a yoga studio, or they see it at a concert. They just don't know the context, where it's coming from, how it's being harvested, the deep connections it has to indigenous practices. And my hope is that this is a receptive audience. I could be incredibly wrong, but that's the hope. And that's why I think like the work like the documentary is such an important avenue, is to really center this in education. And the other angle to this is to really address retailers. I think if we can communicate the larger issues around this to places like Etsy, to places like Amazon, and we show and illustrate and kind of raise up ethical growers of white sage, there's a very real chance that we could shift that and have retailers shift over to cultivated white sage.
Somebody has asked too, shouldn't we all be able to be spiritual and, use, I guess, there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think,
I mean, we call it appropriation, but what, I guess when appropriation is causing harm to the environment, I guess that's the whole point of this. But are we villainizing people's spirituality? They're trying to make a connection.
I think you had the right idea. I think I've heard it best by Gerald Clark, who is a Cahuilla artist and a professor over at UC Riverside. He says that cultural appropriation, at the heart of cultural appropriation, is the idea that something's been taken, and the key word is taken. So something hasn't been given back. And I think in the idea of burning white sage, the reality is the white sage that most people are burning has been literally taken and stripped out of the landscape, so that when you're burning that white sage, you are effectively burning something that's been very irreverently ripped from the wild, stolen from that vast food web that I've talked about, stolen from possibly indigenous people that have been tending that space. And so to think that, if we look at how most of the West views white sage as this a kind of cleansing spiritual practice, if you look at it like that and think that it's going to remove bad vibes, and yet the plant that you're trying to remove those bad vibes with was really effectively poached from a wildland, that's a huge conflict of interest, I guess I might say. So it's not necessarily, I think the beauty in this work and in this campaign, indigenous partners are inviting people to create relationships with plants like white sage. And so if you grow white sage and you create a smudge stick from that white sage, I am only speaking for myself here, but if you were to burn that smudge stick that you created from a plant that you grew, that is a great path forward. I think the breakdown is when the practice is taken from an ecology, taken from a culture, without any acknowledgement of that culture or respect or homage to that culture. So I think, I might not be saying it in the best way, but that's how I would frame it.
What happens to the seized sage? This is my own question. As I was seeing thousands of pounds of this stuff being seized, what happens with that material?
Yeah, so in Etowanda, so I brought up Kimberly Morales Johnson. When the plants are poached in Etowanda, sometimes Ron's able to get that poached sage over to Kimberly and others, and they're able to bundle those the confiscated sage and gift those to community members, indigenous community members. So sometimes it goes over to the Sherman Indian School, sometimes it goes over to various partners and people in the indigenous community. So that's what sometimes happens, but other times it's thousands of pounds. And I think what's really sad to hear, I've just heard from Kimberly, is, one time she got 1,200 pounds, like almost, close to a metric ton of white sage plants, leaves that were poached. And her family were staying up all night bundling the sage, and they could only salvage about half of it before it essentially just rotted, because the leaves were compacting on themselves in those duffel bags. So yeah, it's a pretty sad issue all around, but fortunately some of the poached sage is able to go to community members.
Okay, one mini questions or mini requests, and maybe this is already on the White Sage, CNPS White Sage website, but I think people want a template letter or communique that they could poach and use. And I think that's a valid thing to put up on the website. Is here's a sample of what to say.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
people,
Yeah. And I think in that sense, the campaign is still very new. We're just rolling it out. In fact, we're the first community group I've spoken with about. So I would just wait until we've created that content. We're definitely aiming to do that. And stay tuned on that website that I shared. We'll be creating a survey sign up on that website. So sign up on that survey when it's available, and we'll be posting updates to that. So as soon as we do have a template letter to send to retailers, we'll let you know. So thanks for that.
do you have other partners other than the Native American communities, the indigenous partners? Do you have, is Sierra Club on board, or one thing that I thought of is all of these yoga studios, do they have a union or some kind of an organization that they all belong to? And getting the word out to the end user seems to be maybe the key thing.
Yeah, no, those are really great ideas. I think we're, when we launched the Dudley bill and when our teams led that in conservation, we were absolutely working with other environmental partners. And so, as we grow this campaign, we're going to definitely be looking at that. I think as we've just started it and pulled all the pieces together, the most important thing has been centering it around our indigenous community members, but we'll be looking as we grow it to reach out to other partners. And I love that idea of reaching out to to like some type of yoga guild. I know that a lot of stories are a lot of powerful change happens with just one-to-one communication. Like I've heard a lot of people going to their yoga studios and the practitioner or the store sells white sage or burns it, and just by talking with the person who owns the studio or runs the store in any way, are able to change the discourse there and through education. So a lot can happen just by talking with, again, store managers, people that you see using it. Yeah.
Is your website going to have growing tips, or does it have growing tips on how to get your own white sage started?
That's a great question. It will now. Thanks for that tidbit.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at again, Calscape, I can't recommend Calscape enough, but if you look at the white sage profile, there's some basic kind of parameters for white sage care, just in terms of how much sun and water needs it has. But I think we're definitely interested. Oh yeah, and Anne mentioned Las Politas has a great section there. So there are good resources out there for growing white sage, but I'd love to be able to put that forward.
Have you or are you going to publish an article in Flora? I thought I saw something, but I see so much coming through that I don't know where I've seen it. So is there going to be something written up on Flora?
Yes. So look out for the spring issue, the spring 2020 2 issue of Flora. So that will have, I think, several pieces focusing on the white sage issue. And then we published kind of an initial update about white sage, I think about a year ago in one of the Flora issues.
And I know Flora is coming out online now.
Yes.
To everyone. So that's the CNPS magazine. I'm kind of losing track. I've still got written questions, but I'm losing track of some of the chat. So I'll catch up with that in a second. This is a kind of a question. I think it's a moot point. Can we villainize white sage use?
I don't necessarily think that's the angle. I think the most important part is however someone uses white sage, we really want to educate people on the fact that, the majority of commercialized products come from wildcrafted places. And if you do want to use white sage, the best thing you can do is grow it yourself. And I hope that opens the door for people to then create more of a relationship, not just with white sage, but all types of native plants. So I think it's more about that invitation than it is about villainizing people using it.
Someone had pointed out, and I know this is true, that there are many other plants that are being poached. Manzanita is a case in point for its beautiful branches.
Absolutely. So, I was horrified to go to the LA flower market and see just how many manzanita branches are being sold in floral shops and, for kind of table decorations and other things. And it's also, interestingly enough, used in the pet industry. So I guess for perching for birds.
oh my God.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Okay.
what I will say is, again, we just were able to pass some legislation for Dudleya, which are native succulents, but plant poaching is only ramping up. We're seeing it with cacti. We're seeing it with succulents like Dudleya. We're seeing it with white sage, manzanita. So I think the story, what I'm hopeful is that the Saging the World campaign, yes, white sage is the emblem, but it's really a story about all the plants that are being poached. And my hope is that we can really start to address this idea of wildcrafting at large across California. So definitely know that there are many other targets. Yeah.
Is it true that white sage is slow growing? And maybe that's.
It really depends. I used to work at California Botanic Garden, and 86 acres, all native plants. We had white sage in many different habitat type spaces, different kind of growing conditions. And if it's getting everything it wants and needs, if it's getting water, actually, many people think that, okay, drought tolerant native plants equals very minimal water. But in certain circumstances where white sage is getting everything that it needs in some supplemental water, it can grow pretty fast. The other thing I'd recommend, if you are really interested in gathering from white sage, is to grow it in containers. Containers can actually provide, for whatever reason, in my experience, growing native plants in containers, typically the plants in those spaces grow pretty fast. So those are just a couple insights.
Can your white sage campaign include like a list of retailers or people that, I don't know, are we thinking about bad guys or good guys?
Yeah,
one
thing
I don't know. Do we want a list of approved retailers, or do we want a list of people that we want to target and ask them to cut it the hell out? I mean,
So in terms of retailers, not growers, is that?
I think it's the retailers that are, if they didn't retail the product, there wouldn't be a problem, right?
Right. What we're hoping to do is to look at, we have identified commercial growers of white sage, and they're starting to pop up with more frequency. There's even one in Oregon, which is kind of interesting. But what we're hoping to do is understand like what accreditation these growers are receiving. I know some of the growers have organic certification. So we want to understand who are the official players that are growing white sage where you can purchase white sage products, from, and to establish some type of hub or platform to direct people to. So as we tell people, don't purchase wildcrafted products, we can readily and easily point people to the right sources if they want to purchase it. And so same thing when we start to look at communicating with big retailers, our hope is to have that arsenal of growers, as partners to be able to say, hey, Etsy, how about we stop selling, wildcrafted white sage products? Instead, we can be looking at, cultivated sources, or at least mandating that, anyone that's selling it is selling it from a cultivated source.
And this is another idea that just came up relevant to that. Is there going to be a flyer that maybe would be available that people could take around and, give to a yoga studio or to a retailer or to, so that it would be something you could plunk down in front and say, just want you to know how serious this issue is.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We will develop what we call a campaign toolkit, which will have things like the flyers and other pieces. So again, I think the best thing that I can recommend at this stage is just to stay tuned on the website. When we make that survey form available, sign up for that. And we will just be communicating all of these pieces. So when postcards are available, we can let people know that, flyers. But yeah, that's a great idea.
And somebody asked about donations to this specific campaign. Is there, are you seeking donations for this particular campaign to CNPS?
Yeah, we are actually, and I'll put my email in the chat here. And if someone's interested in supporting the campaign, which would be wonderful, you can contact me directly. And we have a couple different options for support. So currently, we're looking to address or explore legislation. We're creating the documentary, and we're doing some other communications pieces with the campaign. So we have the ability, if you're interested in any one of those things or just the whole project, we have some opportunities for that.
Just direct any donations. I think CNPS.org has website, and there's a donation button where you can then designate who you want the donation or what program you want the donation to go to. Some other people are saying, how about engaging the Center for Biological Diversity, the Xerces Society, other organizations like that as partners?
Yeah, definitely. I think those are all great contenders. And I think as we solidify the campaign, we'll be reaching out to partners just like that.
And somebody else brought up targeting small businesses as part of education, food, health food stores, things like that.
Sorry, can you say that one more time? I was distracted.
Small businesses, the small health food stores.
Yeah, I think that's where like the element like the flyer is great. And I think being able to have, polite conversations with store owners, especially if you have a relationship with that person, even better. If not, to just have polite discourse about it. And I think being able to point people to sources to purchase white sage. One grower is called Sagewind Farms. Here, I'll put that in the chat. So Sagewind Farms has been growing white sage for 15 years, and they supply wholesale. So, I think as we create that campaign toolkit and put out some messaging that you'd be able to use, part of the conversation with brick and mortar stores is to let them know what the alternatives are.
And I think you just answered one of the questions about speaking to schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to see, I'm trying to play catch up here. Did I miss any question in the chat that I may have skipped over? So if anybody feels they've skipped over you, perhaps, and you're still there, you could go down to reactions and raise your hand.
Yeah. I want to ask if eating too much is bad for you. And
Matthew, are you asking a question?
yeah. I had two questions. One, we recently planted some black sage in our front yard, and we have like these trees that kind of separate the front yard from the back yard. And I was wondering if we could plant white sage in the backyard, and if they wouldn't hybridize.
It all depends. White sage really does have a preference for sun. So if there is shade canopy, if there's like shade coverage, it might not be incredibly happy. White sage and black sage have hybridized before. I've seen hybrids in a kind of a garden situation, depending as long as you're maybe not on the the wildland urban interface. If you're in a urban area, it shouldn't really be a tremendous problem.
Well, we happen to be like right by the Bryant wetlands.
Yeah. So I mean, white sage and black sage co-occur. So hybridization will happen naturally. I wouldn't really be worried about it. But sun is going to be really key for white sage.
Okay, one more question about it. Is white sage edible and good for using in cooking, just if I'm going to grow it?
Yeah, so the young flower stalks can actually be eaten like celery, which is kind of interesting. And the seeds are edible, but chia, for instance, is a salvia. And so the sage seeds are edible. This white sage seeds are edible, but it just would take a really inordinate amount of time to collect white sage seeds in quantity from your garden. So I wouldn't recommend the seeds. You can collect the stalks, but I would really, if you're looking for culinary sage plants, like black sage is an all-star. I love black sage for seasoning. White sage is the leaves, the aroma is like, for my taste at least, way too powerful. But black sage is a really great like seasoning plant.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Anyone else that would like to unmute themselves and raise their hand and ask an in-person question? Matthew, you want
I
to?
don't know if you got this question I asked before on the chat, but are there any plans to contact some organization like Center for Biological Diversity or Earth Justice to get white sage protected under the Endangered Species Act?
Yeah, well, I would say there are plans for us to reach out, and my hope is that as we build the campaign, we'll be partnering with organizations like that. So yes, it's definitely in our top of mind for us.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, all right. I really appreciate the engagement that happened in the chat and being informed by, I think some of us knew a little bit about what was going on with white sage, but had no idea that scale, I guess. Pick up loads full of it, and that is, it's sad. We can only hope that try to make the situation better, and that's all what we're all here to do. So, David, I really appreciate your making the presentation. I hope that people will go to the website and stay engaged. And if you're not a member of the Native Plant Society, I encourage you to join. If you're a student, it's very reasonable to be a student member. And it's actually reasonable to be a regular member too. So that will keep you informed and know what's going on with native plants. There's a lot happening right now with the California Native Plant Society. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
David.
no problem at all. It looks like Melissa just had one last question.
Melissa?
Oh, she says it looks like she's fine.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was really a pleasure to talk with you all.
Okay.
Okay.
Everybody's done. Thank you. I'll say goodbye. Bye-bye, everyone. Peace. Stay healthy, please. Take care of yourselves.